All right. Hello, everyone. I see attendees trickling into the room here now that we've opened the waiting room. So we're just about to go ahead and start the panel. But a couple of housekeeping things right off the bat. Feel free to use the chat function if you're having any logistical or accessibility issues, and to write in and say hello. Let us know where you're calling in from. And then use the Q&A function throughout the panel to write any questions that you may have. I'm just seeing the number shoot up here, so I'm going to give it one moment before I jump into an introduction and get us started.
Julie, I have one attendee that's texting me that they're being asked for a password. Is that in the webinar invite, do you know?
I am not sure. Let's see if Brenda can help us with that.
It shouldn't be asking them for a password if they've got the right link. So maybe can they check their email for something from about an hour ago?
Joe, there's someone in the chat saying that they have to sign into Zoom in order to open the link. So perhaps that's what's happening to that participant. But yeah, perhaps while that's getting organized, now that we've got quite a few attendees in the room, I'll go ahead and get started with an introduction. As I was saying, for those who have just joined, please feel free to use the chat to say hello to us. Let us know where you're dialing in from. And then throughout the session, use the Q&A function to ask questions to the panelist. All right. So a big formal hello to everyone who's joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Julia Sawatzky, and I'm a resident doctor based here in Edmonton, Alberta. I am one of the board members of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, or CAPE, and a co-chair of CAPE Alberta. I'm joining this call today from Treaty 6 territory, where I'm a settler and uninvited guest on the traditional lands of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Stoney, Dene, Iroquois, Ojibwe, and Saulteaux peoples. As we talk about the history, present, and future of resource extraction on these lands, it is critically important to recognize the ways in which Canadian settler colonialism has and continues to shape this process with disproportionate economic, social, cultural, and physical harm to Indigenous communities. In the spirit of reconciliation, let us all commit to thoughtfully applying what is shared and learned here today in a way that actively promotes the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples across so-called Canada. Today's event marks two important milestones. As a physician-led environmental organization, we at CAPE are acutely aware of the multiple intersecting crises that threaten the well-being of our communities. At times, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed by grief and anxiety as we do our part to chip away at these crises. As a result, I think it can probably be said that we don't celebrate our wins often enough. Today, however, we will celebrate an incredible triumph in Alberta's energy transition and the role health plays in ongoing efforts to secure a healthy and just future across Canada and beyond. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat here because I want to make sure people are getting in if they're able to. It looks like that's all happening. So to kind of frame the context of this panel, in November 2015, the government of Alberta committed to a phase out of coal power by 2030. However, that goal was achieved years ahead of schedule with the closure of Alberta's last coal plant earlier this year in spring 2024. A decade ago, Alberta relied on coal for close to 70% of its electricity, meaning that the impacts of the completed phase-out are immense. In fact, it's estimated that the Alberta coal phase-out had an effect on approximately 5% of Canada's emissions. While initially, many critics thought a phase-out by 2030 would be challenging or even impossible, Alberta's rapid transition 6 years ahead of schedule offers a hopeful roadmap for other jurisdictions. Completing the phase out across Canada is estimated to impact a further 3% of our national emissions. Health messaging around the detrimental impacts of coal played an important role in advocacy for the Alberta phase-out, including the harms associated with coal-related air pollution, toxic environmental pollutants, and contributions to climate change. Alberta's win can, therefore, also provide a roadmap for CAPE and its partner organizations to frame an accelerated phase-out in the rest of the country as an urgent health issue. The Alberta coal phase-out is one of many issues on which CAPE has advocated, and today we also celebrate 30 years of this unique and incredible organization. We are honored to have such an incredible lineup of speakers joining us today to celebrate these milestones, share lessons learned, and envision the road ahead. Again, I'm just checking the chat to make sure that our accessibility issues and tech issues are all being sorted. If anyone's having any trouble, just please let us know in the chat there. But then without any further delay, I'm really excited to introduce our panel of speakers. The structure of this event is going to be kind of in two parts. So a first panel of 3 people and then a second panel of 2 people with opportunities for everyone to answer questions as a group at the end. So in our first panel, where we hone in on the Alberta phase out, we are joined by Dr. Joe Vipond, Graham Thompson, and Ben Thibault. So to start, Dr. Joe Vipond has been a practicing emergency physician in Calgary, Alberta for more than 2 decades. His firsthand exposure to the health impacts of climate change has fueled his decade-long commitment to environmental advocacy, where he played a pivotal role in both the Alberta and Canada-wide coal phase-out campaigns. Canada-wide coal phase-out campaigns. Coal phase-out campaigns, I'm sorry. A former president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, or CAPE, Dr. Vipond is also the co-founder of the Calgary Climate Hub and a board member of the Global Climate and Health Alliance. He continues to champion policy reforms for a healthier, sustainable future. Hi, Joe. Next, we have Graham Thompson. Graham Thompson is an award-winning Edmonton-based columnist and political commentator with over 30 years of experience. He has covered Alberta politics for more than 30 years, first with the Edmonton Journal and now as a freelancer with various news outlets, including the CBC, iPolitics, and Alberta Views magazine. Known for his sharp political insights, Graham regularly appears on national radio and television programs, offering in-depth analysis of Alberta's ever-evolving political landscape. Welcome, Graham. And the third panelist on our first segment of today is Ben Thibault. Ben Thibault is a senior strategy advisor at Prairie Sky Strategy with extensive experience in renewable energy, climate, and electricity policy analysis and advocacy. Over the last decade and a half, Ben has been involved in the Pembina Institute's clean energy transition work, served as a senior climate and electricity policy advisor to Alberta cabinet ministers and the Premier's office, and held the position of executive director of Solar Alberta. A key figure in the Alberta coal phase-out campaign, Ben continues to apply his strategic insights to advance renewable energy and decarbonization initiatives. So, hi, Ben, and welcome to all of you. So that everyone knows who's on the call right off the bat, I'm going to introduce our second panel as well, where we're going to broaden our lens to look at the coal phase-out happening in other jurisdictions. So in this second panel, we'll hear from Drs. David Mains and Mo Qureshi. Dr. David Mains, PhD, is the Chief Policy Analyst for the Saskatchewan Coalition for Sustainable Development and an expert on decarbonization pathways, particularly within Saskatchewan's electricity sector. With a PhD from the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Mains has over a decade of experience developing strategies for transitioning to a low-emissions future. He is also the co-founder of MCN Bioproducts and the author of The Price of Carbon, contributing extensively to research and policy on climate change mitigation through these efforts. Hello, David. Someone in the chat is saying, quite the eminent panel. Thank you all. I agree. I'm getting very, very excited to hear from these folks. Finally, last but very much not least, we have Dr. Mo Qureshi, PhD, who is the Director of Climate Research and Policy at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick and a board member for Ontario Nature. With a PhD in chemistry specialized in renewable energy, Dr. Qureshi is a renewable energy expert, scientist, and active conservationist. He has advised the Government of Canada on its federal sustainable development strategy and was recognized twice by Starfish Canada as one of the top environmentalists under 25. Welcome, Mo.
Thanks.
Excellent. So, a huge welcome again to all of our speakers, and a big thank you on behalf of CAPE for taking the time to join us. We have a lot to learn and share here today. So I'm going to jump now into our first panel. We're going to take about 30 minutes to hone in on the Alberta context and the big accomplishment that we're all here to celebrate. So my first question I'm going to direct towards Joe and Ben. And the question is, what was your role in the advocacy for an Alberta coal phase out? Who else did you partner with, and what did the advocacy process look like for you? To get us started, maybe I'll pass it over to Joe.
I was muted. No, I'm no longer muted. Yeah, I went through a lot of fussing about climate early on in my career. Like I started to learn about the climate crisis around 2007, and it took me about 5 years of fussing. Waking up at 2 in the morning in a cold sweat, fussing about things about. What if, and unfortunately, a lot of those what ifs are seeming to be coming to pass. But I was invited by a professor of social work at the University of Calgary to come and be a part of. I'm going to forget his name. Ben.
Mishka Lysak.
Mishka, of course. I'm having a lot of brain farts today, so apologies. So Dr. Mishka Lysak was a colleague of my wife who's a social worker, and he said, we have this group at the Pembina who's putting out a report on health and coal, and would you want to be a part of that? And the report was pretty much all policy analysts and engineers, and so they were like bringing me in for a little bit of a medical perspective. Now, to be fair, I had no experience in air pollution or electricity at all, but I do know a bit about health, so I was able to provide a little bit of context going through. I was not an author; I was just an advisor. But when the report came out, and of course I read it like 10 times and memorized it, and essentially did a fellowship in a combination of air pollution and electricity over the next couple of years. It became very natural for me to be a spokesperson for this report, because who better to talk about health and coal than a physician? And so I kind of went from advisor to spokesperson. And then as I started getting more involved, I started going, hey guys, what about this? Hey guys, what about this? And so I started to be more part of the team. And it's really important to know that there was a few of us, but not a lot of us, right? So there was Ben, myself, Mishka, Kim Parada, who was the ED of CAPE, Gideon Foreman, who was also involved with CAPE, Tim Weiss, and I think that's about it, right? That's the six that I always think of, Ben. And over the span of about 3 years, we convinced the government to put in a coal phase out. Now, it's really important to know a couple of things. The first is that the NDP government was the one that put in the coal phase out, but we know for sure that the Conservative government would have put in some kind of coal phase out as well. We know that because we had conversations behind the scenes. This was a pretty natural target for the Alberta government to take. And they would have done it differently, but it probably would have happened. But we did do it. One of my favorite quotes is, when the impossible becomes merely difficult, you've won. And I remember that evolution, because there was this period of time where people were like, they're never going to do this. TransAlta is so powerful. These power companies are so powerful. But we pulled it off. So that was kind of my, I guess, initial impressions. But the reason why I really want to emphasize that there were 6 of us that were guiding us is that number of 5% of Canada's emissions, and granted, it was the easiest 5% of Canada's emissions, but it was 6 people dedicated to trying to get this out the door for a few years. And thanks to Ben for, he was, I can't think of how many times I turned to Ben in the middle of the night. Hey, Ben, I don't understand this part. What the heck does how do you do electricity pricing in Alberta? I don't get this. And he would just hold my hand and guide me through the process. And it's amazing. So anyways, I turn it over to you, Ben, because you were there from the beginning, really.
Oh, that was great. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I worked on this file in a few different roles. First at the Pembina Institute from 2010 to 2016, and then in a few different positions with the Notley government for 2016 and 2019. And there were many people involved, but I think it's very clear that Pembina and CAPE, if Joe as a part of CAPE, were the most crucial to the effort. Pembina was involved with this going back well before I joined Pembina in 2010. At first, it meant stop the bleeding, right? So it's shocking to think of this now, but 20 years ago, Alberta was actively approving very large new unabated coal plants. And so Pembina legends like Tom Arlang and Chris Severson Baker, and I'm sure colleagues of theirs as well, worked tirelessly to make this more difficult at the time. Tim Weiss, who Joe mentioned, kind of carried the electricity file for Pembina for years before I got there. And he started, once I got there, he really started the steady drumbeat of concerted and tireless publications and events to build a coalition, and then media efforts and messaging to start seeding the public discourse on this. So by 2011 or 2012, we were doing at least 2 reports a year, one of which Joe mentioned, plus multiple op-eds and blogs, TV and radio news appearances. And we continued this right through 2015 when the phase-out was announced, and even after. And in 2012, we led the effort to kill the last approved coal plant, which was called Milner 2, so that it would never be built. So we kept $2 to $3 billion from being locked into the most polluting power source, because once they're built, it becomes more of a challenge, as we learned through our process of phase out, to close them. And so around the same time, Tim sparked the first collaborations with health organizations and to jointly produce reports and coordinate messaging. In the early days, as Joe mentioned, Gideon Foreman brought his experience from Ontario and the Ontario coal phase out, and enabled some initial collaborations. And Joe came in, we had initial collaborations with the Asthma Society and the Lung Association, who were able to join on to kind of co-authoring or at least co-publishing some of our publications, which gave them a lot of the health credibility. CAPE continued as an absolute critical component. Joe was a tireless, avid, constant force for that. It would be impossible to tally how many volunteer efforts Joe has put into what has been this immense success. And we'll get into later, I think, how big of a success this has been. But like, nobody should ever forget just how much Joe did for that. And so many people were involved and many organizations jumped on to advocate for phase out. But to my mind, it was really Pembina and CAPE who were critical and consistent, and both are really the unsung heroes on this. And this continued after I left Pembina too. After I joined the Notley government, they announced the climate leadership plan, and Pembina continued pushing on this to make sure that it was implemented successfully. I became then a part of implementing these policies from within the Notley government, and the decision makers in that capacity deserve a ton of credit too for sticking their necks out on the topic. Joe's right. There were comments from basically all parties in Alberta that there would be a desire to end coal and that the benefits of that would look like. But I could tell oodles of war stories and policy development and implementation learnings from that experience and the different stakeholders that you had to navigate in order to accomplish this. And so while everybody had an intention to, I don't want to downplay just how important it was that there was a champion in leadership in government to stick through it, get through it. And I just want to point out that like this wasn't coal phase out sounds like a single policy initiative, but it really took like multiple different types of policies with multiple ministers. There was really 4 different ministers who in different ways were focused on this, and I could go through that, but it wasn't just one policy. Actually, Tim Weiss and Andrew Leach and I wrote a chapter in a book that kind of relays exactly how, from a nerdy policy perspective, how the Alberta phase out, backed by the federal phase out, and then also backed by the really smartly designed industrial carbon pricing policy for the electricity sector, allowed for the phase out to happen so much earlier than was legally required by 2030, right? And so, like I say, there's an entire chapter on that. We could do a whole webinar on the kind of nerdy public policy end of this, but it really was crucial to have a devoted champion that didn't lie down once it became difficult through the coal phase out in government. So yeah.
And just before Graham weighs in, and just to riff on what Ben started off, it's important to recognize that for the Alberta people, when we started in, like when I started in 2012, I guarantee you that if you polled the Alberta people, not only did they not realize how dirty coal was and how much of a health impact was, the majority of the population wouldn't have been able to tell you that our electricity came from coal, because hydro was kind of conflated in our minds with electricity across Canada. I'm sure I was guilty of this in my childhood. It's got to come from dams, right? Why would we burn coal for electricity? Anyways, I just wanted to preface whatever Graham's going to follow up with that context.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe and Ben, for starting us off. There's so much there, like so much that was introduced that I think we can hopefully dive into during this panel, and probably a lot more that we aren't going to be able to cover today, but that I'm hoping will get people thinking. Another one of my favorite things about a panel like this is when you get such an eminent lineup of people, and then they all start talking about the other wonderful people, and really like giving credit to the people that they've worked with, and it being such a collaborative effort, which is really inspiring to see. And then I'm going to jump over to Graham with a question that kind of picks up on what Joe said, which I've written down and circled twice to remember for later, about the impossible becoming difficult, and that being such a framing for success. And so, Graham, with this coal phase out having once looked impossible, and watching the progress here in Alberta, were you surprised that it was accomplished? And kind of against the political headwinds, what do you attribute this success to?
Yeah, look, I'm surprised it was that quick. And as Joe pointed out, they were in a trajectory to phase out coal. We go back, this actually began under Stephen Harper, phasing out some of the coal plants, not all of them. And then you had, of course, the NDP was on it, pulled the trigger to say, we're going to do it, basically phase them all out. But even though Kenny admitted they'd have to follow the federal plan, in 2018, go back to 2018, before he became premier, he was fighting against the phase out. He was talking about clean coal. Remember that clean coal? That's tied into carbon capture and sequestration. The idea is you keep on burning coal, you capture the CO2 emissions, turn them into a supercritical fluid and inject them underground and keep them in there. But you had Brian Jean at the time. Their debates were very much during that leadership race. Brian Jean and Kenny were saying clean coal. We don't need to phase out coal. We can just turn it into so-called clean coal. You know, that's not going to work. I got to say, in a bit of background, I was at the University of Toronto for a year, 2008, 2009. I was given a fellowship. So I was studying carbon-free energy, looking at carbon capture. In fact, I was then, after my year was up, I was commissioned by the Monk Center for International Studies to do a study on CCS. Can it work? Yeah, and I said, small scale, yes. Moderate scale, yes. Big scale, no, absolutely not. But so you had this government, the UCP now, of course, has gone along with this. But even now, the UCP politicians will criticize this speedy phase out. Nathan Neudorf, the Minister of Utilities Affordability, just back in August, was saying, you know, one reason why the energy prices spiked in this province, it's the NDP. They had this really fast phase out of coal-fired plants, coal-fired energy, blame them. At the same time, though, they'll take credit for the emissions reductions. So they'll still complain about the phase out, but yet they're going to say, yeah, well, we're reducing emissions. Same with methane. Emissions have been reduced, but that's all thanks to the NDP, not to the UCP. But the thing is, yeah, so congratulations to Cape and Ben and Joe for pushing forward this phase out, and it is a lot faster than people expected. And this was a combination of government working with the power companies. Also, it did cost money. The NDP, I think, paid over $1 billion. It will be paying over, well, the government's paying over $1 billion over sort of a number of years to help alleviate the pain to the power companies. But a bit of a negative Nelly here, Grumpy Graham, that yes, phase out of coal, absolutely, 2 thumbs up, big win. You have a government now that's still very much promoting fossil fuels. This is the government that brought in a moratorium out of the blue on solar and wind projects. And the premier still can't explain why she brought it in. And it's very much the context is this is all about promoting fossil fuels. And it's all about next big step for Alberta is blue hydrogen. That's the idea, take natural gas, turn it into hydrogen, cleaner burning fuel, obviously, but you have a ton of emissions left over. That's why the provincial government and also the federal government are really big on spending money on carbon capture and sequestration, which not just me, but any expert in the world is going to tell you this will not work at a large scale. So I'm being a bit of a negative person here by saying, yes, coal phase out is good. You still have a government that's really tied to the idea of producing more fossil fuels. And they're taking credit for reduction in emissions thanks to the NDP. So I think there's that dichotomy still going on. And it's a win right now in terms of coal, but the future to me is not that bright when it comes to reducing emissions further in Alberta because of the ideology of the current government.
Thanks
Ben,
so
it
much.
might be a good time to show your slide. I want to see that and show it to Graham and have that conversation about how the different policies worked. But I guess in context with that slide, I always have this question in my own mind: did we actually do this, or would it have happened anyways? Like that counterfactual. What if Pembina and Cape didn't exist? Would we have naturally had a coal phase out? Would have come later? Would it never have come? I don't actually know the answer to that. I'm curious. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts would have happened. Again, Kenny was saying, look, Kenny was saying, look, the federal government has its own plan to phase out coal. We got to go along with that. So even though he wasn't saying that during leadership race in 2018, he's referring back to Stephen Harper, this idea of just phasing out 12 of the 18. I think what would have happened is it would have come, but not at the same rate, not as quickly, and it wouldn't have been all the coal-fired plants. The NDP targeted all of them, as opposed to just some of them, the older ones. The newer ones, I think that Kenny would have he would have kept on letting them run the way that Stephen Harper wanted them to run. But you had the federal Liberals, in a sense, forcing this issue on Kenny. I think that he would have been reluctant, a lot more reluctant, if you didn't have yourself and Cape to come along. And of course, the NDP is the one that really did make things move. And then, of course, after he becomes premier, would he have reversed all of that? I think that he would have had a problem reversing it, but I think there wouldn't be the same kind of impetus to keep on reducing emissions that we saw the NDP bring in, and which is why we are seeing that now with the UCP when it comes to emissions. So if coal, looking at coal, I think that he would have been very hard pressed to reverse any of that, but the emissions would have come down faster. I would say if the NDP was still in power, the emissions would come down faster than what we see under the UCP, because they're determined. Well, look at the emissions. You've got the premier, of course, fighting the emissions cap that the federal government is proposed to bring in on oil and gas. And she is fighting that cap, calling it a production cap, saying that this is the federal government out to destroy Alberta's economy by putting a cap on production. Well, that's not a cap on production, it's a cap on emissions. But the thing is, she's attacking the federal government. This is all politically motivated. And this is something, to me, it's stalled the issue. We were on a trajectory to reduce emissions significantly. And you can be thankful for that, absolutely, under the NDP. But now we're seeing this UCP government stall things and potentially increase emissions. We're seeing the intensity being reduced from the oil sands. But the NDP wanted to reduce emissions overall, and this government, UCP government, is not doing that. So I think it's stalled. And I think that the trajectory is not the same as it would have been if the NDP had clung onto power. But one of the things the UCP is very good at is blaming things like the carbon tax as well for killing the economy. And Kenny was the very same way on that. So I think that Kenny would be in a box to try and reverse stuff. He couldn't have reversed it, but I think he would have slowed things down.
And so on this topic of emissions, like as Joe was saying, I think this is a great time to, Ben, if you're able to pull up those slides and kind of talk about some of the concrete impacts of the phase out in terms of emissions, and then we can kind of expand from there in terms of policy shift, jobs affected, like what were the impacts of the phase out?
Yeah, so I do think this is something of an undertold story. So I want to just like from an emissions perspective, just get across how huge this was. So frankly, climate advocates are not good at celebrating victories, and frankly, it's not hard to understand why, because the fact is, whatever progress we've made, we're still in a climate crisis, and we're still adding to the load of atmospheric greenhouse gases at a rate that will frankly bring catastrophic global average temperature increases. So naturally, for anyone who believes in science, it's hard to celebrate right now. But this effort to constrain climate change to reasonably safe levels is a marathon. And it's crucial for the movement's endurance that we celebrate this. So I want to pause for a moment just to say thanks to CAPE for putting this together, because this moment of this year with the accomplishment of the phase out may have passed without that. And because it would have been a real shame to let this moment go by without proper acknowledgement. And during my time at the Penman Institute, I kind of came known among the staff there for having coined a cynical term for the work we were doing to marginally reduce the rate of growth in emissions in Alberta, which were still growing year over year back then. And I called it creating a less worser world. And so let me just take a moment to review how much less worser the world will be due to this achievement. So in 2015, coal emitted 44 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a good deal more just from coal in Alberta. It's a good deal more than that's per year. Than all emissions from all sources in all 4 Atlantic provinces, plus throw the 3 territories in for good measure. It's more than twice Manitoba's entire emissions as well. So the high polluting capital in place would probably have run between 20 and $40 billion of actual capital that was in the ground in Alberta doing this pollution, plus the $3 billion that we diverted away from being sunk further when we stopped Milner 2. And I ran the numbers with the Pembina team in 2021. I wasn't there anymore, but just needed to do a bit of a victory lap on a report called From Coal to Clean. And we found that the emissions reduction from the electricity sector from 2015 to 2025 are expected to be around 40 megatons per year by 2025 relative to 2015. So even netting out the increase in emissions from the replacement generation, so what has to be generated in order to replace that coal, we ran the numbers as coming out to 40 megatons. So the Alberta coal phase out would be tied, if this does come to fruition, once it's all done this year, it would be tied for the largest emissions reduction measure in North American history. And does anybody want to guess at what it's tied with?
Ontario coal phase out?
The Ontario coal phase out, which was another initiative where CAPE and Pembina were crucial. So unless someone wants to show me a larger climate policy measure that I haven't thought of, the collaboration between these organizations is responsible for the 2 largest emission reduction measures in North American history to date. So talk about making a less worser world. But seriously, I'll pull this up really quickly. So the extent
While
of
you're pulling
this,
that up, I'll just mention that it's important to remember, and Graham kind of alluded to this, the most recent plant in Alberta was built in 2011. So it's not like this is like near like old history. They were still building coal plants in 2011, well past the time that we knew that coal was bad, air pollution was bad, and climate was dangerous.
So what this is showing is just the blue dot here is basically what would have happened under what Graham mentioned, what I call the Harper regulations, the 2012 federal regulations, and an estimate of what would have happened to coal-fired emissions had those been left in place without further action. And as Graham noted, I think it was 12 out of 18 units were to come off by 2030. That means 6, the largest 6, would have still remained, and the last one would have been allowed to continue to emit unabated until 2061. The 2030 phase out alone, if you just assumed that everything had to come off in 2030, of course, would have just dropped this line in 2030 itself. But that layering of policies that I mentioned, particularly the industrial carbon pricing that was applied to the electricity sector, meant that instead these emissions came down on this trajectory, meaning that this area under the curve is effectively the total amount of emissions that were avoided from coal power thanks to this. And you can see that here, which is just year over year, what is the emissions reduction owing to the extent of this phase out. So when we did this report, we thought that the coal plants were going to be done by 23. Turns out they're going to be done in 24. So we lost a year there. But in any case, we're getting up to close to 40 megatons per year. And again, this is net of replacement generation. So this is accounting for what megawatt hours have to be put into the grid to replace this. So seriously, talk about an untold story of a huge climate victory notched against some pollution Goliaths by some environmental Davids. And more people need to hear about this. So thanks again to Cape, and for everybody who's on here, donate liberally, please. But thanks to Cape for putting this together.
And Ben, just for clarification's sake, and I don't often give credit to the Kenney government for good things, but the reason why the accelerated coal phase out happened was specifically because they kept the structure of the industrial carbon pricing so that anything burned above gas emissions, like any carbon that was burned above gas emissions, would be fully priced, which is not what they had to do, right? Like they could have chosen a path that would not have been as strict.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. And this is a part of what locked in the policy in a really interesting way. So when the Kenney government came in and replaced the Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation, the CCIR, with the Technology and Innovation and Emissions Reduction Regulation, the TIER. So CCIR becomes TIER. And what they did across almost every industrial sector, well, across every other industrial sector, was to replace the sector-wide emission standard with a facility-specific one. And that is unfair because what happens is the worst polluters are allowed to come down a certain amount and the lowest polluters have to come down as well. So you're actually taking, well, what the CCIR had done with electricity was say, no, everybody has to meet the standard. So if you're a bad polluter, you're going to be paying a ton. A lot, I should say, in this context. Ton is confusing, but you're going to be paying a lot. If you're a good performer, you don't. And if you're below the standard, you're actually going to create credit. So it really created an across the board incentive. And what that led to was a very quick flip of coal is no longer economic. And when the Kenney government came in, they retained that element for the electricity sector only. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating with respect to how effective that was for reducing emissions quickly by having that sector-wide standard. And a part of the reason for that is because, frankly, the electricity sector knew they were going to have to phase out their coal emissions by 2030 under law anyway. So there wasn't a strong stakeholder lobby to change the tier so that it was no longer sector-wide. So it's really that layering that created the conditions for there not to be a very strong lobby to undermine this. And that's really what survived. To Graham's point, Graham is 100% right. There was a lot of weakening of climate policy in 2019, just happened to be not in this sector. And it's because of this layering. Andrew Leach calls this defense in depth, and that's part of what protected it. Yeah.
Ben, if I can do one more question at you, because I think it's important for the audience to understand as well. Part of and I'm kind of a bit of a left-wing lunatic, so I think theoretically I should be like maybe for non-corporate energy, but one of the reasons why this, correct me if I'm wrong, was easier is because we had corporate entities running our power grid. They just did the calculation, right? There was no political analysis. I think we're going to hear from David later about Sask Power, that there's political machinations that are happening beyond just the calculation on a calculator, right? To decide whether things should be open or closed.
Yeah, I think on that point, I would say like having this privatized sector created different challenges, because you certainly at the point of the NDP putting in the phase out plus the CCIR, you had a very strong lobby against those elements from the coal owners, and you had coal owners coming to government and saying, we can't transition things to gas. If you're going to phase out coal, you're going to shut down this capital, you're going to burn capital and shut down these facilities. And a part of what the NDP government did, using some experts, was to call them out on that, to say, no, they're transitioning plants from coal to gas across the United States. So we don't believe you, effectively. And so pretty quickly, a demand for compensation from the coal companies of around $16 billion pretty quickly became 1.14 or 1.4, I'm blanking now, but $1.4 billion, a fraction of what was originally demanded for compensation for phasing out capital. And the reason is because most of this capital has been able to continue on with a cleaner fossil fuel effectively.
Awesome. Yeah, gosh, I'm learning a lot, and I can see in the chat and the questions that other people are as well. We are going to be transitioning to our second panel in just a bit here, but I want to pose one final question to this panel, and maybe we'll start with Graham. But what we want to hone in on now is what was the role of health in the Alberta coal phase out, and what health messages, when it comes to climate, when it comes to emissions, resonate with Albertans?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Joe would probably speak to this better, because I'm thinking back to the phase out, and a lot of it was, of course, climate change. This is a government. Finally, the NDP brought in these restrictions, phase out coal, because they really did see, and it's true, climate change is a major problem. And the UCP government, of course, even now refuses to use the term climate change. But I remember it being more about climate change and warming climate and more extreme weather events. The federal government, of course, spoke about phase out coal, that's cleaner air, and there's fewer deaths related to coal, burning coal. Of course, there's a huge problem around the world when it comes to people dying from lung diseases. Again, Joe is the expert on that. I certainly am not. But I think when it comes to the issue of climate change, I want to focus on that for a second, the term climate change. This government refuses to use those words together. They will not talk about climate change. And at news conferences, I've pushed the premier on this. Does she accept climate change? And she'll say, well, of course, but it's all about reducing emissions. So when you push her on the term, she'll say, I prefer to talk about we're reducing emissions. Because the thing is with this government, any government, if you talk about climate change being a real problem, then you have to find solutions. You got to deal with climate change a lot more seriously than just saying we're all about reducing emissions. That's a lot more vague. And this government is focused on being vague. And it comes to reducing emissions. Again, I've said this before, they'll take credit for the reductions that have come about because phasing out coal, but they refuse to give any credit, of course, to the NDP, or even talk about how it's helping, in some ways, reduce the threat of climate change. Listen, during the wildfire in Jasper, a terrible catastrophe. And after that was done, I was pushing some of the ministers to say, well, now we even talk about climate change. They'll talk about forest management. They'll talk about pine beetles and how they've left a lot of dead wood on the ground. Of course, pine beetles, you could attribute that, of course, to climate change. The pine beetles became a lot more of an issue because of warming climate. But they won't talk about climate change. They'll focus on other issues. And that is because they're playing to their base that doesn't believe climate change is real, or it's a problem that's been overblown. And this all ties into getting back to Smith and her leadership review. These are things her base doesn't believe in climate change. In fact, one of the resolutions at next week's annual general meeting for the UCP is basically to say, hey, carbon dioxide is a building block of life, and we should treat it as such and stop calling it a pollutant. And this is playing to that base, that Smith is also refusing to discuss climate change as a real threat. So going back to your question about the narrative about helping health, I didn't see that so much. Joe and Ben would have a lot more to say about this. I saw it more tied to climate change, NDP believing in that, bringing in a carbon tax, and then the UCP's done all it can to, of course, Kenny scrap the carbon tax, being of a federal price on carbon. And we'll see what happens if Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister, what happens to that price on carbon. So I think that this is a problem for the future that is not going to be solved anytime soon because of the partisan nature of our politics.
Joe, do you want to close out this segment of our panel with just kind of bringing it back to what the health considerations were?
Well, I do want Ben's perspective on this too. Maybe Ben, you can go, because I think you had, because Ben has a different perspective, right? You're an engineer, right, Ben? So for you, the policy guy. I can't remember what your background is, but it's not health. And so, but I think throughout you saw the utility of the co-benefits framing, and then maybe I can just close up once you kind of speak about how, because it was kind of at the front and center, I think, for most of it.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, hearing Graham's perspective as somebody who was clearly watching the discourse as a journalist, I think it actually was really interesting because from where I sit, and I'm not an engineer, I have a legal background, but I'm a policy and political strategy kind of nerd. But to me, it in the moment it seemed really crucial. We'd learned this from the Ontario experience, where the Toronto smog had attracted a lot of attention to this issue, and the phase out almost eliminated smog days in Toronto. And so it took a bit more work in Alberta to make the connection because the linkage from coal pollution to palpable smog wasn't as clear here. So you had to do a lot more. It had to make the case on the basis of sort of the huge proportion of SOx in Alberta, and mercury in particular, upwind of Edmonton, that were being emitted by coal plants. And it was massive. Like, I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but the proportion, I mean, the proportion of mercury was over 90% from coal in Alberta. The proportion of SOx, it was well over half. And then connecting this to particulate matter in Edmonton, which was, does have some amount of smog. And so there was a lot of analysis that had to go into substantiating the connection and extrapolating from findings that the Harper federal government had quietly made about the health benefits of reducing coal power, and using that information on our side was very effective. But the work to make these connections, and then plus the consistent, clear message from credible sources like the health community, was really crucial, so that Albertans that consume local news were actually getting a fairly steady drumbeat of credible health concerns about coal pollution. And like to Joe's point from earlier, it really actually started with Albertans not even knowing that their power came from coal. It wasn't actually that hard to convince Albertans, I don't think, or people that were paying attention to this issue, or politicians, decision makers, influencers. I don't think it was hard to convince them that coal was dirty. It already had that branding. It was actually more shocking to people that we still used it in the early 2010s. And so we had survey data on that. Most people did not name coal as the major source of generation. And so we needed to move that needle, and then at the same time say, well, not only is this pollution making your air unhealthy, but linking it to to clear health impacts, asthma for children, developmental issues, stuff like that. And so it was really key to have the messenger, CAPE, the health organization that I mentioned earlier. It was really easy, frankly, to have a clear villain that people were already willing to accept as a villain, but we had to make those connections for people because the awareness wasn't there. And yeah, I think that was what was crucial, and to do it while wielding a credible voice of the health organizations was I think a lot more effective than had we just done this as an environmental organization, which was the Pembina Institute, for sure. And then what we ended up with by 2014, to Joe's point earlier, was literally the leader of every single party, PC, Wildrose, NDP, Liberal, and Alberta Party, having made some kind of public statement about intent to phase out coal. So yeah, it was very effective over 3 years.
I want to end with a couple war stories, if I may, Ben, and I may name drop your name here. I don't know if you remember. I think it was you. I had this idea at one point, and I'm like, wait a minute. Ontario has phased out, I think it was almost all of its coal power, but not all of it. And we just opened up a new plant in 2011 upwind of Edmonton. What if we track the PM 2.5 in Toronto and compared it to the PM 2.5 in Edmonton? What would we see? And just so everybody knows, PM 2.5 is particulate matter 2.5. It's bad. You inhale it, it gets in through your lungs and your bloodstream and causes people to die, essentially. Cardiovascular issues, strokes. It's directly linked to mortality. It's the bad air pollutant. And I can't remember if it was you, Ben, sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but somebody ran the analysis of the Pembina and said, holy Christ.
Andy Reid. It was Andy Reid, who deserves a shout out in this as well, who did the analysis. But yeah.
It's worse than Toronto's air. And so we released this to the media, and suddenly I think it was the CBC and Edmonton Journal that had like they had embargo rights to publish the story. And I remember waking up one morning and looking at the Edmonton Journal and going, "Oh my God, we're on the front page above the fold." And anybody who's in like knows newspapers knows that's where you want to be, not just on the front page, but on the front page above the fold. Because like in the old days, there were newspaper boxes, and they would sit on counters, and you would see that. That was the thing that hit with you. But I think, it speaks to a couple of things. We had a myth of clean Alberta air, right? Clean prairie air. And Toronto, what's Toronto's nickname? The Big Smoke, right? And so this was really impacting a lot of the myths that we had. And everybody has a friend or a daughter or a neighbor who's got asthma or a grandparent who's got COPD, and suddenly those wheels were clicking. And so the co-benefits, I think, was really what sold this. People, I think we're short-termist, right? We care more about 100 deaths a year, which is what our initial modeling and a costly diagnosis showed, 100 deaths a year, than however many umpteen deaths are going to occur from climate change in 20 years. That's just the reality. And I'm going to share my screen for one thing, because I want to share this picture. At the very end of the coal phase out, we ran this ad in the Globe and Mail. It was a full page ad. And it was intended to show the broad swath of Albertan society that cared about the coal phase out. Now, probably in my mind, the most important thing is the photo at the top, which is my mom and my daughter. So when you get to run a campaign, you get to choose which images you use. So there's like, do you have an image that'll reflect the broad swath of Albertan society? So they're so beautiful. My mom has passed away, so it's particularly poignant, of lung cancer, by the way, if you want to really put a point on it. But if you look at I think there's about 40 organizations and institutions that are on the bottom of that page that have signed off on this letter. We basically circulated this open letter. We highlighted 8 institutions: Alberta Medical Association, Lung Association, Asthma Association, CAPE, the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, the Alberta Public Health Association, the Canadian Public Health Association, and the United Nurses of Alberta. There's a reason why they're highlighted and the rest are not. It's because they're all health organizations. And we really thought that was essential to talk about this as a health issue, because yeah, you get the climate benefits, but you also save lives too. And how fun is that?
Thank you so much, Joe. That's an amazing way to kind of frame what's happened in Alberta and bring it home. Like, I can see the chat, the heart reacts going off because it is personal, and everyone who's here is here because it's personal in some way, shape, or form. And to kind of see not only that health was brought into it, but your family is a really powerful lens to view the Alberta coal phase out and who we're doing this all for. So thank you so much, Joe, Graham, and Ben. That was a phenomenal first half of this panel event. And now we're going to transition. So we're going to turn to David and Mo and talk about what's happening in your jurisdictions and how it's related to, but also how it's different from what's happened and is happening in Alberta, and how some of those impossible things are becoming difficult and moving towards progress. So I'm going to start. I'll open this question really to both of you, whoever wants to dive in first, but just to tell us a little bit about kind of an overview or update of where things are with a coal phase out in your jurisdiction, what the advocacy work that you're doing there is, and how it's going from your perspective.
Ben, did you want me to go first? Or sorry,
For
Mo,
sure. Go for it, David.
yeah, okay. Yeah, Saskatchewan, much different situation than Alberta. And if you just sort of rise above and look down, SAS Power runs the entire system here, and they own the bulk of the generators, and they operate the bulk of the generators. So we got sort of a monopoly. They're a crown corporation, so it's directly linked to the government. We have not had an output-based pricing system in place that's had the teeth to drive down, to create the economics that drove down the emissions, which is one of the reasons for the accelerated coal phase out in Alberta that we've heard about here. So we've got a situation now where really hasn't changed that much in terms of coal as a contributor to the energy mix in Saskatchewan. We've got 1,400 megawatts of coal-fired generators and 3 active stations. Last year, they were running about 65% of capacity. And there's another thing that just occurred to me here. We're burning lignite. For those of you who don't know what this is brown coal or soft coal. It's the lowest grade of coal, and it differs considerably from the higher, from bitumen. You've got about 30% higher intensity of emissions. That is the amount of emissions per unit of electricity. Is generally viewed as more health harming, and we heard how the harming effects of burning coal in Alberta. And these coal plants that are continuing to operate here in Saskatchewan, they pump out 9 million tons a year of CO2. And this hasn't gone down that much. Coal contributes 30% of the electricity, but it's responsible for 65% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from electricity in Saskatchewan. So it's like anywhere else. If you shut down coal, you get a tremendous benefit. And just a little bit of policy wonk here, because it's somewhat important. Saskatchewan doesn't operate right now under the federal coal regulations. They have an equivalency that was negotiated with the federal government. And this allowed for continued operation of coal-fired units beyond the 50-year limit that was specified in the federal regulations. And so what happened in Saskatchewan is all the emissions were pooled, and if they were below a threshold, then they could continue to operate coal plants over that 50-year mark that's part of the coal regulation. And that's what's happened. We've got a couple of generators at the Boundary Dam facility that are over 50 years old, and they're still going. So where are we headed with this? And this is where it gets very interesting. If one takes a look at the new SAS Power report, they've got a section on where they foresee the energy mix transitioning over the next 5 years. And if you look at this, it's quite exciting. They're talking about bringing in 2,800 megawatts of renewable capacity. Half the coal plants would be shut down within 5 years. And the energy mix is actually aligned with the modeling that's been done by Navius and also by at the University of Regina study that just came in for compliance with the clean electricity regulations. So that all looks great. And you look at this and you go, that is really exciting. It's really neat to see this coming from the Crown Corporation. There's a great big but. And you can put this, you have to underline this, blow up the font, and put it in bold. The but is something called the Saskatchewan Affordable Power Plan, which the government of Saskatchewan has promoted strongly to the media. They formed an economic assessment tribunal to look at this power plan, and then the tribunal through the Crown Corporation hired Navius to model all this out. And what they did was they removed all restrictions on coal. So they said, forget it. We're not going to comply with the federal government, and we're just going to continue to run these coal plants to end of life. And if I'm going to share my screen here just to show you guys what this is actually kind of neat because there, if everybody can see that now. So what we have here is emissions projections going all the way to the year 2050. And this is done again by Navius modeling. And the orange line here is compliance with the clean electricity regulations and compliance with the coal regulations. This darker line here is the Saskatchewan Affordable Power Plan, which was modeled by the Economic Assessment Tribunal. And the coal plants continue to operate, and then their phase out happens from 2030 to 2035. And we have a much delayed rollout of renewables compared to compliance with the clean electricity regulations. If you add up the total emissions to mid-centuries, there is 100 million tons of carbon dioxide that will be released under this Saskatchewan Affordable Power Plant compared to complying with the clean electricity regulations. It's immense. And you can forget Canada meeting its targets for 2030 or 2035 if this plan is implemented. And so this is where we're at right now. We've got this bizarre situation of the Crown corporations just in their annual report saying, yeah, we're going to clean up our act. We're going to roll out renewables quickly. We're going to phase out coal. And the role of the gas plants is going to be to back up and balance renewables. Yet at the same time, the government, and SaskPower was part of this, sponsored this study for this, what is, a really frightening plan to continue operation of the coal plants with a delayed phase out and delay in the rollout of renewables that would release an incredible amount of emissions. This is justified by economics, and the economics, frankly, can be seriously challenged. What has to happen here, and I'll end up just with this quick comment here, is for the government to negotiate with the federal government a proper structure of investment tax credits and to negotiate some changes to the drafts of the clean electricity regulations, give them some more flexibility. And if you do that, the costs will not be imposed on the ratepayers of Saskatchewan. You can design this so that the clean electricity regulations can be implemented. We can get clean electricity here in Saskatchewan without affecting the rates. So that's, hope it didn't go on for too long, but I just wanted to summarize a relatively complicated and somewhat bizarre situation here for messaging especially.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. I learned a lot from that. And I think a lot of what I took away from the first half of this panel too is just how multifactorial the processes of getting a phase out going and the different actors involved. And it sounds like the situation in Saskatchewan is quite complex. Mo, over to you to hear a little bit about the context where you are.
I'm just gonna add a bit more complexity to this story, where in New Brunswick we have a bit of overlap between what David was saying and what Joe and Ben were talking about in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. We have the Belledune Generating Station, the one coal plant currently operating in New Brunswick. It's a 450 megawatt coal reactor, and it is planned to be phased out in 2030. However, when it comes to phasing out this particular reactor, the discussions on what are the alternatives, what are we going to use instead of this, and previously it was constantly pushed either switching to fracking or biomass. Right now, at least for the coal reactor, they're already pushing towards changing the Belledune station to a biomass station. So instead of burning coal, burning trees. So we've kind of taken the stance of you shouldn't be burning anything to generate our electricity. We have technologies that can make things. We have wind, we have solar, hydro, anything that can produce electrons to create clean energy for our grid. But with the discussion of going from converting to biomass, we also have in southern New Brunswick a lot of shale gas, which brings up a lot of animosity within New Brunswick as well, because in 2013, 2014, a moratorium was placed here. So there's already been some resistance locally against fossil fuels, which is nice to see. A lot led by the climate health intersection of those discussions that led to the moratorium. But we still have our issues on phasing out coal and finding better alternatives that can help clean up the grid rather than continually emitting. So it's kind of one step forward, two steps back where we are. So right now, coal is about 10% of the grid in New Brunswick, and as that phases out, we'll see what the changes at Belledune will be, and hopefully we can push against it being a biomass reactor.
Yeah, certainly, as you were saying, some different layers involved as compared to Alberta, as compared to Saskatchewan, and certainly makes this all very context dependent. Another question we were hoping to ask you today, both of you again, are what are some of the lessons learned from the Alberta phase out that are applicable to your context, or so kind of, I suppose, then drawing on some of the similarities where you see with Alberta.
Yeah. The one, I think, very powerful lesson here is the impact of carbon pricing through the tier system in Alberta, and how, I mean, there was other policies that drove this, but once it's in place, it's a powerful motivator. Maybe a little less so in a situation like in Saskatchewan, where we have a Crown corporation that owns the bulk of the generators. So, you know, you get a less of it just looking at a spreadsheet and saying, yeah, we got to get rid of this because it costs too much. But, you know, an output-based pricing system that's got some teeth in it can really drive down emissions. And that has just been failing. It's just simply, we have a system here, but it's just weak.
And for us, I mean, in New Brunswick, we do have an output-based pricing system, which is helping to reduce some of it, but it could be managed a bit better, in my opinion. But also, I mean, comparing to Alberta, Alberta kind of had a phased out approach. And right now, Belledune is mainly being used to supply during peak demand times. But in New Brunswick, we also have a Crown Corp. NB Power runs most of the grid and pretty much acts as a monopoly as well. And see lessons from Alberta, seeing that kind of private sector involvement to help invest and accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, especially with having a Crown Corp that is primarily debt. It's hard to get new projects off the ground. So there's not enough capital to build new renewable generation. So we're kind of locked into the fossil fuels based off these existing reactors that we have. So if we could learn from Alberta, bring in a bit of that private investment and a bit more of a phase-out approach, I think New Brunswick can reach that target a lot faster.
And we've talked a lot already today in the Alberta context about politics and how the different political parties have shaped the process. And Mo, do you think the recent election will have an impact, or how do you kind of see that playing out?
It will certainly have an impact, but because the previous Higgs government, his last kind of comments on Belledune were that if we need it beyond 2030, we're going to keep burning coal. So he was kind of firm that it may stay a coal reactor and they might not do the conversion to biomass. But now with the Liberals taking over, it's doubtful that they'll continue pursuing coal beyond 2030. However, they aren't completely against fossil fuels either. We've talked to them about closing the moratorium and legislating a complete ban on fracking within the province. And they were resistant to that because they thought the moratorium was enough. But if it's still on the table, then it's still being considered in any energy plan. So we want to completely remove coal or natural gas or frack gas off the table, so that way we can really build an accelerated clean energy strategy. It'll be interesting to see what the new Liberal government will do, but it's a bit too early to tell.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. That'll be something to watch, I'm sure. Okay. So now I think, and we've got so many questions coming in the chat and the Q&A. This is a really engaged audience, which is just amazing to see. But we do want to turn a little bit towards health. So in your context, in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, I am also having some brain farts today because there's a lot going on here. But in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, what is the role that health is playing, and how would you see the health community contributing to your efforts?
I could start us off here. Even though Alberta is right now dealing with the coal phase out, which once again, congratulations on accelerated timeline on that. But in New Brunswick, our parallel is with fracked gas because of the moratorium. People really resonated with that. There's not so much discussion around ending Belledune early because there isn't a strong enough link made, at least on the East Coast, between that. It's more of a link in Nova Scotia where they're more reliant on coal than we are in New Brunswick. So people are kind of working on that, but having lessons learned from the moratorium in New Brunswick, the moratorium was put in place because of that link between poisoning our water and fracking the ground and all those chemicals coming in. And the locals and the local Indigenous community, the Elsipogdog First Nations, everyone around that region, they refused to have their water source poisoned. And that kind of led to that protest and revolt that led to the moratorium there. And I think we kind of need the same kind of approach with coal in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia as well. We know there's a direct link between negative health consequences. We don't even have enough doctors in New Brunswick. The wait lines are extremely long. So any solution we have to prevent a further healthcare catastrophe down the road is a worthwhile investment. This is why these basic climate solutions are so vital, because it saves us our healthcare costs in the long term. It saves us all that turmoil later on. So I think we got to learn from what Alberta has done and learn from how we put a moratorium on frack gas and kind of shift that focus towards coal.
Yeah. Yeah, I echo with what Mo says. Right now in Saskatchewan, it's basically, and it's just not discussed, the health issues, but that's almost a failing on the environmental community to a large extent, because these are real here. Even though those coal plants are not close to densely populated areas, there's still people that live there, and they're going to be impacted. And this is something that we should make people aware of in Saskatchewan, and especially when you consider the quality of the coal that's being burnt here, meaning low, and there's higher ash content, higher sulfur content, along with the greenhouse gases. And this would be a strong messaging that could be put together in Saskatchewan.
All right, Joe, do you want to? Yeah. And I would invite all of our panelists, if you want to turn your cameras back on and we can kind of come together. Well, I'm going to start drawing from the chat and from the group, and also feel free to ask each other. Go ahead, Joe.
I have a question for David and Graham, and this is about CCS. Boundary Dam 3 is one of the only CCS plants in the world. It's pretty small. It's about 150 megawatts. I think it's about 180 megawatts, but 30 of those megawatts are parasitized to create the CCS. At one point, I think they were going to convert the other 2 units at Boundary Dam to CCS, but that has been canceled by the Saskatchewan government, to my knowledge. And there is no further efforts to develop CCS on coal, to my knowledge, in Saskatchewan. So I'm just wondering, David, if you can speak to that and how it's impacting the coal use in Saskatchewan, if at all. And Graham, you also mentioned in your conversation that the Alberta government and the oil sector is wanting to use CCS to further its emissions efforts here in Alberta. And with the failure at Boundary Dam and many other places in the world, maybe Shell Quest being the exception, one of the few exceptions here in Alberta, how that CCS failure, obviously multiple governments over the years have promoted CCS, and this current government just the latest, right? So first to David, and Graham, and you have some thoughts on this as well, because I suspect you know this topic deeply.
Yeah. Okay. I would say failure is a very strong word. It was the world's first. And you know, if anyone's been involved with large industrial world first projects, there are always overruns and issues associated with this. I am not a fan at all of CCS applied to coal. You still get residual emissions. It's extremely costly. And what have you accomplished relative to renewables? You know, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. I do see, and this is a bit controversial, I do see a potential role for CCS applied to biomass. And if you have sustainably sourced biomass, we've got a lot of it in this country, and a huge potential for getting residues from agriculture and forestry, and then burning them to make electricity with CCS. The bulk of non-greenhouse gas pollutants are captured along with the CO2. So it's not like burning coal in terms of the health impacts. And it's a huge opportunity in Saskatchewan to take residues from agriculture and forestry, especially when this is linked to forest management, and create a negative emissions industry. Not everyone agrees with this, but I'm quite a strong proponent of it. And Drax in the UK has successfully converted 500 megawatt unit, and they plan to do 2 more over to biomass, and then add CCS to that. And it's a huge part of the UK's overall plan to get to net zero. And Saskatchewan and Canada, I think, should take a real strong look at BECCS.
And if I can jump in here, I'm a real skeptic when it comes to CCS. And I've studied this at University of Toronto. And the problem is that CCS has not lived up to all the hype. But politicians keep referring to it because it's an easy out, in a sense. The technology will save us. And yes, Saskatchewan's used it, but it hasn't lived up to any sort of targets. And we're seeing even in Alberta, you think back to when this idea became an issue for the Alberta government, was under Ed Stelmach, 2008. $2 billion to kickstart some of these projects, experiments. And he was talking about sequestering 150 million tons a year, I think by 2050. And we're doing maybe 2 or 3 million tons a year right now. There's 40 million tons worldwide. Yeah, because governments keep returning to carbon capture because it's a way for them to say, look, we can keep on burning fossil fuels and reduce emissions, but it hasn't lived up to the hype. And look, and small projects, absolutely. And I think that Pembina, Ben could speak to this, is seen carbon capture as one of the arrows in the quiver. I think it's a term that they have used in the past, but it's not the end all be all. IPCC has said, no, it won't be the way to save us. Same with the Alberta Auditor General in Alberta said that this is not living up to the hype that's being created. And the thing about carbon capture is that you look at how politicians, though, but this is one of the areas that the politicians in Alberta and the federal government actually agree. You've got the Liberals in the provincial government here, the UCP, that don't get along really on anything, are agreeing that carbon capture can actually make things better at a large scale. And I don't see that happening. Vaclav Smil, he's an expert in this, University of Manitoba. He has said, look, and he's a pragmatist when it comes to using oil and gas. We need those for our economy. But he is saying, look, to make a dent in emissions at a larger scale, you need to build a parallel infrastructure to pipe all the supercritical CO2 through pipelines and put it underground, sort of parallel to what we have right now for oil and gas production. And it's going to cost billions and billions of dollars to do this, and no one's talking about spending that much money. It's really expensive. So I think carbon capture is, I think Mo is right when it comes to smaller issues, yes. But when it comes to the big issue, when it comes to actually making a significant dent, all indications from experts is it won't work at a really large industrial scale.
Sorry.
Very, very quickly, I think there's a distinction that should be made between negative emissions bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and industrial carbon capture such that would be applied to the oil and gas sector. You're just reducing emissions there. And that's why, and like you said, incredibly expensive, uses a huge amount of energy, and you're just reducing emissions. Then we're going to have substantial carbon dioxide withdrawal. There's no way around it. Agriculture is going to be residual emissions from agriculture globally. To get to net zero, that's got to be negative emissions to compensate for that. Two ways to do it: direct air capture or BECCS. And if you look at the economics, it's not even close. BECCS makes sense. So I think it's a mistake to say there's no role for carbon capture and storage at a large scale. There is, in my mind, for negative emissions, and Saskatchewan and Alberta too are ideally positioned to implement negative emissions through BECCS.
Mo, do you want to jump in here?
Sure, yeah, just to jump on what Graham and David were talking about, any proposed solution for a coal phase out varies by region. In carbon capture, not only is this technology not viable, we don't even have the geology in East Coast Canada to implement it. So it's not even a realistic solution for half the country. And furthermore, I mean, trying to switch from, at least in New Brunswick, a coal reactor to a biomass reactor doesn't solve anything either. I mean, coal is so much more dense than biomass, so you're going to need a lot more woody biomass fuel to operate the same sized coal reactor. So it's just, it seems that we're, when I'm looking at the questions in the chat as well, there's so much talk about these transition fuels, but how long are we going to transition for? Right? Natural gas was the transition fuel 20 years ago. And even today, we're still talking about it as a possible transition fuel. I mean, the transition is done. We need to reach that end game sooner rather than later and stop wasting time on these outdated technologies that aren't going to help.
Yeah, Mo, I agree with you. The sentiment coming out of the chat and the questions, like it seems to be definitely on people's minds, like what is next, where do we go from here? And so I'm gonna also, as we near the end of this panel, and I have so many questions that people want to ask, I want to hone in on kind of thoughts about the future. So we're celebrating 30 years of CAPE, we're marking the Alberta coal phase out, we're looking to other provinces. For all of the panelists, where you are, what are you hoping to see or working towards where you are, and kind of what would be some of your things that you're really hoping to see in the energy transition in the next 10 years?
You have to pick somebody, Julia.
Yeah, sorry, it was a big question too. But Mo, were you going to jump in there?
Sure. What I would love to see, at least speaking from East Coast perspective, when I think about Nova Scotia being heavily dependent on coal and New Brunswick still teetering the door of more fossil fuel or not, we're really lacking transmission infrastructure on the East Coast to start connecting a clean grid together. Where there's tremendous wind, solar potential in the East Coast, but it's quite a distributed energy system that we need. So kind of, I wish the conversation would shift towards modernizing our grid, having distributed energy resources, more community energy projects, more small scale but distributed systems that are well connected, so that way we can start trading clean electricity instead of being dependent on coal or fossil fuel trade. I think that's the kind of system that I'd like to see in 10 years. And I think that'll really help with cutting emissions and starting this thing forward.
The Canada's energy regulator and others have really been promoting federal-provincial cooperation. And I think this is absolutely essential, especially if we're going to build transmission corridors. This adversarial approach has just got to stop. And yeah, we see in Saskatchewan, it's really bad, and it's simply it's just, we're not going to be able to pull this off. We've got a small grid here in Saskatchewan, we're surrounded by larger grids. We've got minimal interconnectivity. That's got to grow. And if it does, then we can just build up renewables and sell cheap power, export cheap power. But cooperation amongst governments levels is paramount to get through the energy transition.
Love that. Seeing lots of thumbs up reactions in the chat there. Ben, I'm gonna send it over to you. What would make the world less worser 10 years from now?
I'm in a somewhat pessimistic mood just looking at the politics that we're watching in the US and just across the border in BC, that they could almost elect a climate denier, and Alberta's about to see the UCP convention endorse a resolution that says that CO2 is plant food. And that's not a joke. So I think we've lost a degree of consensus across the political spectrum, where there was different degrees of action that were desired, but there was, at least it was not allowed anymore to be a straight up climate denier, and we may actually be losing that consensus, which is a concern. I wonder if that means that we need to go back to the hard work of convincing the public, and a little bit less focus on the political level. And I think that health organizations in CAPE, I think there is an opportunity. Like there's not so many issues where there's a natural fit between health. Climate is always going to be a health issue because climate change will cause health impacts. And if you're not aware of this, go outside when it's plus 40. But there's also the coal issue in Alberta had this connection to air quality, asthma for children, other direct health impacts that were not indirect via climate change. And there are issues like that still. We are exposed to a lot of pollutants through tailpipes. A lot of people are not aware, we are exposed to a lot of pollution through the combustion of natural gas in our homes. So if we want to talk about how NOx can impact people breathing, we have children trying to develop lungs in our homes. My own, like I have not converted, but this is something that is poorly known. And we should, if we're not going to convert old homes that currently use it, because that's tough to do, should we at least be stop building and doubling down and locking into to burning natural gas in our homes? And I think that those are issues that kind of honing in on those could be a great climate outcome, but also have that connection to health. And I'm really sorry to do a quick tangent, and I'll try to focus back, but I just noticed through the participation list that Lois Corbett is on this chat, and I just need to do a shout out to somebody who is absolutely integral to the Ontario coal phase out. And people in New Brunswick probably know her well, and that's certainly been where she's been lately, but she was absolutely instrumental to the Ontario coal phase out. And I feel a little bit awkward that I commented on Ontario previously, knowing that Lois was listening. So I hope I didn't get anything too wrong, but thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, lots of wonderful people in the chat. I've also been noticing that many of my heroes and people doing incredible work where they are. So we're really lucky today. We've got 3 minutes left in the panel. And so I want to respect everybody's time and wrap up on time. So I'm gonna just
you got to let Graham and I talk. Come
yes,
on.
don't worry. I'm getting there. I'm gonna pass it over to Graham and Joe. If you just keep your comments on the shorter side as we wrap up these last couple of minutes. Maybe we'll go to Graham first and then Joe.
Yeah, so quickly, a lesson to be learned by all the work that's been done to get the phase out is that initially people said it couldn't be done. You couldn't do it this quickly. And of course, it's even faster than we thought it was going to be done. But the government of Alberta, the UCP government, didn't take that as a lesson, because they're continuing to say we cannot get to net zero by 2035, like the federal government. It cannot be done. We'll do it by 2050. But the lesson here is that you can get things done a lot quicker if you actually put your mind to it. But the UCP government doesn't want to do that. And in fact, they have no plan even for 2050. And a question came up even a few days ago with the premier at a news conference saying, well, where is your plan for even phasing up by 2050? And they just don't have one. So the lesson that has been learned by many people is not being learned by the provincial government, that things can be done and a lot quicker if you put your mind to it, but the UCP government is not putting its mind to it.
All right, I'll wrap up, but I can't go slow, Julia. Come on, because I want to tell a story, and stories take time. So when I was in Nepal, I was there for a couple months, and I reached out to an organization called Clean Up Nepal, who is doing. There's a lot of plastic pollution in Nepal. It fills the rivers, and so they were basically on weekends they would clean up a space. And so I went to one of their events, and we went into about a 2-acre area. I showed up on a Saturday morning to clean, and it was just filled with plastic. It was just totally packed with plastic, like layers upon layers. And I'm like, we can't fix this. It's too big. It's like massive. But there were 25 of us, and we looked down, and I looked down, and I started picking up one piece of plastic at a time, and just focused on an area and got bigger and bigger. And at the end of 2 hours, we had totally cleaned up that area. So the climate crisis is big. It's overwhelming. It's like, I can't do anything. I'm paralyzed. And there's very few types of power, right? There's money and corporate power. There's political power, but there's also grassroots power. And every single person on this call, and the 6 of us, thank you, Ben, and others, we worked our grassroots power to make change. And we picked up a piece of plastic. It was a big piece of plastic known as the Alberta coal phase out, but it was one piece of plastic. And we just got to consider this, even in this time of crisis where things are accelerating and getting worse fast. We need to accept the fact that we need to break it apart, look at it piece by piece, use our grassroots power, and make the change that we need. And this is doable, but we all need to get involved and make the change we need in the world. So there's only 2 valuable things that people have, right? Time and money. And whichever one you can afford more of, support the action. It doesn't have to be CAPE. There's a lot of incredible organizations doing incredible work. But get involved. That's how we make change.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joe, for that closing. I just want to finish by saying a huge thank you to all of our panelists for your time and energy, for sharing your wisdom, and for all the work that you've done. Like, I am here in Alberta breathing cleaner air because of the work that you did. And I'm also inspired to keep going because I get to be in rooms like this, and like the engagement in the chat and the Q&A today has given me chills. Like, people really care about the work that you do and that we all get to be part of together. So thank you also to all of our participants, and a huge thank you to Brenda, who is CAPE's 30th anniversary campaign coordinator, who's done a tremendous amount of work to bring us all together today. So yeah, I think we'll wrap up there. Sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but thank you all for your energy. And
if you live in Edmonton tonight, we're having a party. You can reach out to me by DM on Shitter or Blue Sky, and I'll get you the information.
Yes, it's at 5 p.m. at Campio Brewing. Come join us.
Great, Julie. Now all the trolls are going to come.
I just thought about that, Sarjo. Trolls, don't come.
Well deserved. Congratulations to the phase out.